Cornell graduate, as I am, and it's one of the reasons I think we get along so well. And after Cornell, he went to Caltech and got his PhD in engineering there. And he's been here at UCLA in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering since 2003. Jeff is a strong believer in participatory democracy and shared governance and so on.
I'm not going to talk about that stuff today.
Are you still the chair of the Faculty Executive Committee for Engineering?
Until June 30th.
Until June 30th.
And then I become vice chair of my department, so so I can't stop that.
So he's doing his part to keep the institution going as well as doing his research. And one of the most impressive things that he's told me that he's been involved with in recent times anyway, is he has a book in press.
Yeah, it's impressive. Yeah.
When is it going to come out?
I think in July. Yeah.
In July. And it's only 500 pages, and it's all about aeronautical engineering.
It's only 470. Don't scare them. Yeah.
Anyway, so Jeff has kindly agreed to come over and talk to us about natural locomotion, a non-biologist's attempt at distillation.
Yeah, I was trying to find the right words to use in this title. I didn't quite get it, but so I'm trying to deflect responsibility with this title. That's my main goal. So I'm an engineer, okay, as you can tell from the department I come from, but I would even classify myself as a typical engineer, so I'm more of a physicist and a mathematician, and so I look at these problems from maybe a physicist point of view, and I also like to analyze them sort of mathematically. And so what I mean by distillation, you'll see by the problems by the different examples I give in this talk. So thank you, Malcolm, for inviting me. I just want to make sure that's clear, that I'm really honored to speak here and honored to address you guys on things that I don't usually get to talk about that often. So my research group is all over the place in the fluid dynamics world. It may not seem very broad to you, but to a fluid dynamicist, this is quite broad. So we work on problems in aerodynamics of agile flight, and I'll show you an example of that today. Also physiological and biomedical device flows, so we're working with people in the medical school on problems in their purview. I mean, my main topic today will be this third one, bio-inspired locomotion, and we work on other things as well. So basically we're just hard to pin down on what sort of fluid dynamics problems we work on, because I find a lot of things that are interesting among these things. Okay, I'm going to give these motivating videos here to sort of start the process. None of these are from anything I did. In fact, 2 out of the 3 are from George Lauder's lab at Harvard, someone that Malcolm knows quite well. And the third one down below is actually, let's play them all sort of simultaneously. So the down below is a fruit fly just undergoing some simple maneuver. This is from Jane Wong's group at Cornell, also a Cornellian. And so she was studying insect flight at the time, and so I stole one of her videos. Okay, and we'll be talking about that today. The upper left-hand corner is a bluegill sunfish, and it's a view from the rear. I'll play it again. Oops, let's see if I can do it again. Yeah, okay. And so you can see the pectoral fins sort of come out and come back in again. So there's quite a bit of flexibility in those fins, and that'll be motivating some of the things we talk about. And this one on the upper right-hand corner is one I find quite intriguing. This was done also in the Lauder lab by Jimmy Lau. So this is a fish in the wake of an obstacle. You can't see the flow, but the flow is going from bottom to top in this view. And this is a fish has positioned itself just in the wake. And so it's adopting a gait that they believe is energy efficient as it tries to keep station in that place. So that's something we'll talk about as well. Okay, so the guiding research questions that overarch all this, I think are quite broad. So the first one is very broad indeed, which is what are the basic mechanics by which creatures move in fluids? But I mean, that's so broad that it's almost ridiculous to use that as a central question, and we have to be a little more specific. But that's going to be something that we try to pare down into individual subtopics here. But one of the things that has always fascinated me is the question of flexibility. All creatures have some degree of flexibility in either their body or their appendages. Okay, it could be their wings or fins or the body itself. And I've always been interested in how that could be exploited for locomotion. It's something we don't often deal with in sort of human-made technology, because we're generally trying to build things that are as rigid as possible because they're predictable. But that's not necessarily a good thing. And the reason why we don't have more flexible structures is often because we don't really understand it. We don't really understand how to use it to our advantage. We can use it in an aircraft wing, for example, to some extent. So if you've ever, most of you have flown in an aircraft and you look out at the wing and you might see the wing going up and down a little bit, right? It does bend, and that's actually by design, and it's designed to bend in a way that isn't adversely affecting the flight, but it's there nonetheless. But we try to minimize that effect if possible. But of course, as we just saw from those movies, creatures in nature, of course, have much higher degrees of flexibility. So I'm kind of curious about what the roles of those are. And are there other features that a creature could exploit? This will motivate some of the things that, for example, Malcolm and I are currently interested in. And I'm going to take this approach that I call sort of an engineer or physicist approach, which is let's set aside questions of other evolutionary pressures on these problems and just focus on requirements of locomotion from the pure mechanics standpoint. All right? So for example, what we know is that the lift force on a creature must balance its weight, and maybe with the inclusion of buoyancy if it's underwater. But this is a general requirement in order for it to hover, for example, or to fly in general. And of course, it might exceed the weight when it wants to take off, and maybe it'll be a bit less than the weight when it wants to land. But generally, those have to be in balance. Okay, so the thrust also must balance the drag force. There's a drag force on something that's swimming or flying, and so any forward motion comes from thrust, needs to balance that. And then the last thing is that usually, not always, but usually energy efficiency is something that's a good thing, and it's something that they're trying to target. Okay, so we would generally want to get from point A to point B with as little energy as possible. So we're going to address those sort of questions, not on specific creatures. I'm never going to show you an actual specific species of creature in any of these examples I give. They will be in very, what I call abstracted form. And what I mean by abstracted will be pretty clear, I think, from the sort of pictures I draw here. So, okay, oops, that's a blank slide there. All right, so there's 3 studies I'm going to show you today. These are studies we've done in our research group. The first one is a hovering insect flight with flexible wings, right? That's motivated by that video I showed you a moment ago with the fruit fly. The second one is just on general sort of body-caudal fin locomotion, which is a large class of types of locomotion in nature. And then the third one is just a variation on that, which is locomotion in the wake of an obstacle. And so I'm going to just add this extra dimension to the study too. Right? Okay, so the first one I want to talk about is flexible flapping, right, in a hovering insect. And so I give this fairly general description on the structure of an insect wing. This comes from Dudley's book, which I was motivated by when I was doing this work, and he gives a nice description of some of these aspects. The wing structure is very intricate, okay, with highly anisotropic stiffness. That just means that the stiffness in this direction is not the same as the stiffness in that direction, and it also varies quite a bit from place to place. There's the veins that run through there, and the wing rotation starts, of course, at the root here, but then it propagates down the wing through a sort of a torsion wave. So the wave spreads from the root to the tip, and that that wing rotation is important because, as we'll see, the wing is trying to adopt a certain angle as it's flying. And then there's what is sort of thought of as a median line of flexion. Okay, this gray dash or black dash line there is a line of flexion where much of the flexibility is isolated, if you want. Okay, I'm going to try to show this video here. It's a link to a YouTube here. Let's see if I can. Okay, this is from David Lenting's lab at Stanford, so I'm stealing other people's videos here. This is his video from a moth. I'm not sure. Someone else can say what species it is. That looks like a bee, I think, right? So I'm not a biologist, so I'm not going to claim any, but what I'm motivated by here is, by the, okay, Stanford News Service, good for you. That was, yeah, so I wanted to sort of back up a little bit here. Oops, that's too far. Okay, so you can see all that flexibility in those wings there, and you can also see the general flapping cycle is this wing going back and forth, and you can see the change of the rotation of the wing as well. This one, if you slowed it down even more, you'd see that this wing keeps rotating itself as it's as the stroke proceeds. Okay, oops. You can see what this is what my son watches on YouTube, so you can see what his whole YouTube playlist is here. So he's corrupted my YouTube playlist here. Oops, that's the wrong. I went to the wrong presentation here. Naturally, it decides to. Oh, come on. Okay, there we go. That's what I want. Okay, so this is that view I showed you a moment ago from Dudley's book. And what we're going to do to abstract this is something that's become quite common in the sort of engineering view of things, which is we're going to imagine that we're just going to focus on a two-dimensional cross-section of this wing and look at the aerodynamics of this wing from in that plane, this slice here. Okay, this is something we do quite commonly in fixed wing aircraft. Okay, wings. So the wing is very long, and so we make the argument that we can focus on one cross section. Now that's a little bit more dubious with an insect wing because this aspect ratio, in other words, the length of this wing compared to its chord, is not so big as it is in an aircraft. I mean, the length of a 747's wing is much longer than its chord length, which is the length in the flight direction. This one is a little more dubious, but we're still going to use this as a basis for studying things, okay? And we'll justify that later if we can, okay? So let me give you a little background review on aerodynamics, right? Much of this is just high school level material, but it's important to distinguish the conventional view of aerodynamics from what we're about to see with insect flight, all right? So a fixed wing on an airplane flies at a fairly small angle of attack. The angle of attack is the angle between this airflow and the angle of the airfoil itself, okay? So that angle is small, and the reason why it's small is we want the flow to remain attached. Basically, we want the flow to be coming smoothly around both sides. And the flow is faster on this side, and faster flow, if you remember Bernoulli's principle, faster flow means lower pressure. So lower pressure means suction on here compared to here, and we get lift, okay? So the lift comes about because of the faster flow and the lower pressure on this side. But it's well-behaved, smooth flow. This is what we mean by aerodynamic, right? You know, that's the term aerodynamic. And they're streamlined, okay? These are the things we assign to this idea. Okay, but insect wing kinematics is nowhere near that. So insect wing kinematics look like this. This is from a review paper by Jane Wong about 15 years ago. And she made these nice diagrams that you can see in other papers of the wing kinematics. So it basically goes back and forth like this. It goes along a stroke plane largely, and the wing is moving on this direction and then moves back along this direction. It just keeps reversing back and forth. This is the normal hovering cycle here. And so as it's moving this way, then it has an angle of attack, but it's much larger, right? This is the angle of attack, and that angle of attack is much larger than it is for a conventional wing. But it's still trying to generate lift in that direction right there. And there's also drag force acting backward as it moves. And then when it changes direction, it's still producing lift this way. But now the drag is reverse direction. Okay, so the drag is the energetic cost of hovering flight. If it's trying to fly forward, then it would just change the whole angle of the stroke plane. So it's like thrust vectoring, okay? If you want to develop thrust, then you move the lift vector this way, so you could change the rotation angle or change the body angle of the insect. Dragonflies are more complicated. I showed a dragonfly here because two wings obviously more complicated, and I'm not going to dwell on dragonfly wings here, but one wing is hard enough, all right? Okay, so what happens when your angle of attack is large? You know, this is the small angle of attack. What happens when it's large? What happens when it's large is something we usually try to avoid in aerodynamics, which is called stall. And so when we undergo stall in an aircraft, that usually means we're falling out of the sky. That's not a good thing, right? So there's stall indicators on aircraft, and if you follow the news with the 737 MAX aircraft, for example, the stall indicators were not working very properly because they had angle of attack sensors on the aircraft that were not agreeing with each other, and they were giving bad information to the flight controller, and the pilots were out of the loop. Okay, so all of these things not going well, but the basis for all that was either stall or a false indication of stall. Bad things usually happen. Okay, but here's what stall looks like from an aerodynamics point of view. So this little feature right here is called a leading edge vortex, right? Or LEV is a shorter name for that. That leading edge vortex is an indication that stall is about to happen. In fact, this process is what's called dynamic stall, right? As I'll refer to in the next slide, I think. Okay, but this is still not full-blown stall yet. This is the early stages of stall, all right? And so what that means actually is something that the insect can exploit. Okay, so stall can be good for a little while, right? This is a plot of the lift force on that wing versus time. Time is being measured here by how many chord lengths of travel has the wing traveled in that. So after 5, that means it's traveled 5 of its own lengths forward in that amount of time, all right? So what this is showing is that the lift is actually quite large. Think of 1 or so, or 1.5 as being what the wing would generally achieve if it was a small angle of attack. It's achieving much larger lift than it would otherwise. But then things drop fairly suddenly, and that's because this LEV here, this leading edge vortex, is about to separate. It's about to detach itself from the wing, and then you don't get the benefits. So why do you get these benefits? It's because a vortex, basically, you can think of as a region of suction. Basically, it's low pressure. This region right here means low pressure. Low pressure means it's basically exerting low pressure on the wing. The wing gets lower pressure, means force in that direction. Okay, so it's sucking the wing upward, if you want, right? So that red line basically indicates how much suction there is in that place. So by the time this vortex is over here, that suction is essentially dissipated. Okay, so at stall, we have bad effects. We get low lift. But for the early portions of time, for those first 2 chord lengths of travel, then we get large lift. Okay, so this is, like I said, it's called dynamic stall. And so insects exploit this. They use stall all the time. They're always in stall, but they're always in dynamic stall. And so insects don't worry about undergoing full-blown stall, because by the time they're about to reach full-blown stall, it changes direction, and now it generates a new set of dynamic stall. So it starts the process here. Let's imagine going up this line right here, and then it switches direction, and then it does the same thing again on the other direction. So it's always achieving that higher lift. And so that's quite different from our conventional aerodynamics point of view, where we're trying to avoid stall. Here it's using that dynamic stall to its advantage. All right, so the timing of insect flight is, and the flapping of a wing is, exploits this feature quite nicely. Okay, so that's a pretty typical view, and that happens whether it's a rigid wing or a flexible wing. We're going to talk about flexibility here. And here's my abstracted model of a flexible wing. So I showed you a wing. So the study that I showed you from Jane Wong there was actually a rigid wing that she was studying in those studies. And I'm going to take that and just add 1 extra degree of freedom, which is I'm going to make a little spring here, a torsion spring right in the middle, and think of this as 2 rigid pieces stuck together with a torsion spring. That's much simpler to analyze than a full insect wing, where I can't really simplify the flexibility into something simple. And So I like this from a sort of a physicist point of view because I can understand how to control flexibility. I just change the stiffness of that spring, all right? And I can study that in a more isolated way. I'm not going to make any claims about insect flight per se with this study. I'm going to just be able to talk about how hovering flight with this system gets affected by its flexibility. So I'm going to show you a picture of that vortex shedding here. This is, again, looking at things like the leading edge vortex coming off the wing, and but it's going to now have this extra degree of freedom that's flexible, right? So you can see this is what are called vortices, okay? So there's vorticity coming off the trailing edge, but you also would see vorticity coming off the leading edge as well. Oops, let me go back and okay, and so let's see if I can, I can't pause it. Maybe I'm not very good at pausing. Okay, I can't pause it. Anyway, it's not that important. All right, so I'll show you some pictures on the next few slides that show it better. So in physics, what matters for determining the mechanisms are ratios of different effects, okay? And what I'm showing here is all the different ratios of things that have a role to play in determining this. Even this very simple model has a large number of different possibilities. So one is the heaving amplitude. How far does it travel side to side compared to how long it is? Okay, that's the first one. The other one is the pitching amplitude. How much does it rotate back and forth as it's doing that? Okay, the pitching axis location, I won't say much about it. It's like, okay, what is it rotating at? What point is it rotating about? This one right here is really important. So remember, we have an oscillatory motion of the wing going back and forth like this, and I have an oscillatory motion of the thing going back and forth like this. What about the timing between those things, right? That's this phase right here. So this is what is the timing between those two types of oscillation? This plays a pretty big role in these aerodynamics, all right? The other ones, so Reynolds number, if you may have heard of before, but may not, this is a fairly common parameter in fluid dynamics. It's a ratio of how important the inertial effects in the fluid are to how important the viscous effects in the fluid are. Those are the two dominant forces in a fluid. And so that basically is like a knob that allows you to just decide those relative roles. And there's other relative forces. How stiff is the wing compared to its own inertia, okay? So stiffness versus inertial effects. And the last one is, how about the inertia of the wing compared to the inertia of the fluid, right? They each have mass, different densities, okay? And so that's another parameter. Lots of different things to play with, but we'll just choose biologically relevant values for them, and not try to explore this entire parametric space. It's way too much to do. And let's just focus on some key aspects of these two right here. In the time that I'll spend on this, I'm just going to give you a very brief story about this. And by the study we did, we were able to sort of look at those two as being probably the most important for giving some insight on flexibility, okay? Okay, so I'm just going to jump right into this plot here that shows basically the effect of that timing, okay? This time phi right here, this phase lead, is a parameter that as I vary it from, say, 0 to larger angles, I can vary this all the way to 90 or 180 if I want. But I'm going to just vary it over from 0 to 70 degrees here, all right? And this is the lift force. And I'm showing two different sets of data here. One is for a purely rigid wing, no flexibility at all on that one. And the other one is for a wing with some stiffness, all right? This is this dimensionless stiffness parameter. And the only thing that really matters to look at here is the lift changes for the rigid wing quite dramatically. It goes from this value of 0.6 all the way down to 0.3 as you change that phase lead. But the flexible wing, all right, stays fairly constant, all right, during that portion. That's a really important observation, because what it means is that even though the phase lead, this timing between the pitching and the heaving part of the problem is important for a rigid wing, it has a big effect and is sensitive to that, it's not so important for the flexible wing, right? So it's able to sort of mitigate the effect of this parameter by being flexible. And so to understand why that's the case, it helps to stare at some pictures here. All right, so this is again a quantity I show a lot, which is vorticity. I've already mentioned this before. Let me explain that vorticity means the amount of rotation in the flow. I've also attributed it to pressure, right? So like this region right here is basically attributed, is exerting low pressure on this wing as it goes past it. This is actually the leading edge vortex from the previous stroke now that's just sitting there, right? And on the rigid wing, it's also there. But now what happens in the next few snapshots I'll show you is that these two features are going to be quite differently processed. Okay, so what happens next is that the wing is actually rotating, and now it's got this old LEV sitting around, and the question is what happens to that LEV? So that LEV right here is now sitting right in front of the wing, and it's exactly in the wrong spot, right? So this wing is going to move back like this, but there's got this low pressure region down here. It's basically sucking the wing downward. It's not a very good feature to have for flapping. Okay, you don't want to be sucked downward. You want the opposite. Whereas the flexible wing, it still has it, but it's weaker. And so what happens next is that basically this flexible wing sort of accommodates that LEV into its wake a little bit better. And by the time it's here, it's basically gone. And so down here is actually showing the lift force. The lift is always positive with this wing right here. It actually is negative for some portions during this one. It actually drops below 0. So that rigid wing has more problems than the flexible one does. Okay, so it's about how when a wing is flapping back and forth, it keeps keeps flying into its own wake, right? So it keeps encountering what it left behind. And the flexible wing is able to accommodate that better. All right, that's the main story there. Okay, another aspect is not just the phase difference between these two things, but also how much it rotates back and forth. All right. So if I have a rigid wing, in order to get lift, I have to actually do some rotation, right? I actually have to have an angle of attack, right? So my rigid wing, if it just went back and forth like this, I would get no lift because there would be no way to exert a force on this wing upward like that, right? So this is kind of obvious, right? If I move back and forth, I get no lift. But if I have a flexible wing, even if I don't actually rotate the wing, I still get rotation because the wing is flexing every time I move it back and forth. So if I move it like this, the wing flexes like this, and it moves back like this, and it flexes like that. So it's adopting sort of a passive change of angle just by its flexibility. So what this is showing is exactly that effect right here, that if the pitch amplitude of the rigid wing is 0, then basically I get 0 lift, right? And as I change that pitch amplitude and make it bigger, more and more rotation of this wing back and forth, then I of course get more and more lift, right? Not a big surprise. But the flexible wing even gets lift even at 0 pitching because of that flexibility is giving it sort of a pitching for free by its own flexion, by its own bending. So this is what it looks like right here. Here I actually threw in a third ellipse just to make it a little more interesting, okay? But it's still a very simple model for a flat, flexible wing. But you can see that there's an effective angle to this wing that wouldn't have been there if it hadn't. So if I measure that angle and plot this again against an effective pitch amplitude as opposed to the actual pitch amplitude that I put in there, I actually see all the data sort of collapse along that. So it's all explained by the same mechanism, that there's an angle of attack here, but the angle of attack is also attributed to flexibility in that case. Okay, so just to summarize this case study of flexible wings, the wing structure and kinematics, of course, in different creatures take many different forms, right? It's impossible to assimilate them all into this study, but it's reasonable to state that based on a few of our observations here that you can probably make a hypothesis that some flexibility makes wings effective over a broader range of conditions, or a broader range of kinematics, for example, right? So flexibility can sort of smooth the effect on kinematic, or the sensitivity to kinematics. Okay, and also something I didn't really show here, but it's sort of obvious when you think about it, that as this wing is moving back and forth, and when it's flapping, then it's going to have less energy cost for that, right? Because the drag is actually less. So if I have a flexible structure, it has lower drag as it's as it's moving through the fluid because it bends in response to the fluid, and so it adopts a lower profile, basically, okay? So the drag is smaller on these flexible wings, and so they're more energetically efficient. But if I make it too flexible, and I didn't show this very much here in the interest of time, then they basically become ineffective as a lifting surface. You can't even really fly with them. So there's an upper limit on how flexible you can make a wing and still have it effective. Okay. All right, so moving on to something totally different, okay, swimming, okay. So this is study number 2. Of course, this is quite different biologically, but it has a lot of mechanics that aren't too different from flying, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So obviously, most fish are not that motivated by the need to generate a lot of lift. Some, of course, do generate some lift, but it's not nearly as bad as it is in air, because we don't have the, of course, in water we have the benefit of buoyancy, which can offset their weight, right? Okay, but I'm interested more in thrust production here. And so here's a view from, so this is a paper from 1995 that Michael Triantafilou wrote, where he was, I think, as an engineer, sort of ahead of his time in understanding the role of the wake of a fish. And this is a nice cartoon rendition from that paper. This is from Scientific American. So these are the vortices. This is the wake of this fish, but each one of these is a vortex. And so I'm going to try to explain what's going on here. Every time this caudal fin beats back and forth, then it's creating vorticity as it moves through the fluid. And that vorticity rolls up into these structures. So this is what we call a vortex. It's a structure of a rotating fluid all sort of put together. You can think of it like a little tornado in there, right? But this thing has a lot of energy to it. And when they're paired with other vortices, okay, of opposite sign like this one is rotating, in this case, counterclockwise, whereas this one is clockwise. If you imagine what they're doing, they are associated with fluid moving this way, or from this side to this side, right? Because of the arrows that you can see are sort of, imagine them like rollers that are rolling the fluid through there. So that means there's momentum in the fluid traveling this way, momentum that way. So those red arrows indicate the direction of momentum. And if you think about Newton's laws, then you can remember that if I have momentum in the fluid this way, that means there must be a force on this creature pointing that way, all right? So it's a balance of momentum in this system. Okay, so if I have, because this fish, of course, is exerting a force on the fluid in this direction in order to give itself forward thrust, right? So thrust is always associated with momentum in the opposite direction in the fluid. Okay, so I'm going to take another sort of distilled or abstracted view of this fish. I'm not going to try to analyze this whole thing. Many of my colleagues in fluid dynamics have done awesome jobs, really amazing jobs of doing large-scale computational studies of things like this. And I'm not going to attempt to do that because it's way too complicated. I like this view, okay? I'm going to think of this as not three-dimensional, just two-dimensional, right? And also not a whole structure of skeleton and muscle and so on, but just 3 links, okay, with 2 hinges. And so these hinges here are my 2 degrees of freedom, right? I have 2 independent hinges. It's much easier to deal with that system than it is to deal with, figuring out how all the muscles are activating in sequence here and causing this to flex its body, and then trying to understand all that structure. It's too much for me, right? So I take this view. And so this sort of skeletal model, this 3-link swimmer, is useful, okay, for understanding some things. So first question is, if I control those 2 hinges, this one here and this one here independently, and just give them a purely oscillatory motion and make it just move back and forth like this, then what will happen when I place it in a fluid? So this is a numerical simulation. It's a computational model of that. And so I'm going to show you this video, okay? Now, you might be a little troubled by the fact that my fish has holes in it, right? That's okay, you can be troubled by that. It doesn't matter, actually. It makes it a little messier, but actually it makes it also a little bit easier to deal with numerically as well. I won't go into the details of why that is. So suffice it to say that, yes, it makes it a little more complicated in this area. It doesn't actually have really any consequence on the aerodynamics, the hydrodynamics of this swimming thing. But what I can point out is that that wake there that you see at the very end is, this is just the same view, just on a snapshot. This wake of this fish has the same sort of structure as that cartoon that I showed you a few slides ago. It's got the momentum, the pairs of vortices, and their momentum is pointing in the opposite direction. So if you want the fancy name for this is what's called a reverse Kármán vortex street, all right? Which is the opposite of a Kármán vortex street, or von Kármán vortex street if you're being a little bit more precise. So a regular vortex street would be behind an obstacle that has drag. This is a reverse von Kármán vortex street, which is indicating thrust, right? So these types of vortex streets indicate either thrust or drag, depending on the orientation of the arrows. Okay, so it swims, okay, so that's good. So basically this three-link swimmer will swim. And so the next question I might want to ask is, okay, well, I just chose a Reynolds number. RE, remember, means Reynolds number. That's the ratio of inertial effect to viscous effect. So it's something that with my very simple abstracted model, I have the ability to decide what that Reynolds number can be. Like how much should inertia and viscosity be in play, relatively speaking. Okay, so what if I just change the Reynolds number to something smaller? Smaller Reynolds number means more effective viscosity. Viscosity is more important. So it's not that surprising to find out that when viscosity is stronger, viscosity is like friction in the flow, right? So viscosity is, if it's playing a bigger role, it means that in the same amount of time, this fish swims less, all right? It doesn't swim as far. This black line is its trajectory that it's gone. This is after 4 strokes or something. So after 4 strokes, this one has gone this far. After 4 strokes, with less viscosity influence, it's moved further, all right? And so that's not surprising, really. And so what we might be surprised to find out, okay, now let me, before I go into the next little surprising point, viscosity is the reason why there's vorticity, all right? All that vorticity that I've shown you, all these slides, this is all vorticity here, all these vortices, okay? The plural vortexes, vortices, all right? All these things are there because viscosity was responsible for creating them. It's the friction in the flow that ultimately leads to this wake, all right? So I'm doing this on a computer, so I have the ability to turn viscosity off, all right? So I can say, you know what, let's do this without viscosity and see what happens, all right? I can't do that very well in a real fluid. The only place where viscosity is sort of off in a real fluid is superfluid helium, which I'm not going to do that, okay? So I'm going to do this on a computer without viscosity. And you might say, well, what's going to happen? I'm not going to get any vorticity, remember? And so the storyline thus far has been that I get momentum in the wake, right? By this vortices are indicating momentum in the wake. So what do you think is going to happen if I turn viscosity off? Is it going to swim at all? Or is it going to swim even better? So what do you think? Anyone want to venture a guess? No one's bold enough. Or maybe it's so obvious you don't even feel the need to answer it. Okay, so what do you think? Anyone want to be bold enough to, if I turn viscosity off, I get no vorticity, is it going to swim at all? No, okay. That's what a lot of fluid mechanicians would have said as well, until my friend Eva Kanzo at USC proved them otherwise, that it swims better actually. So this is an inviscid swimmer. This comes from, so Eva's work, I forgot to put the citation here. I put it on a different slide. So this was a study of hers from about 15 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, where she just explored the same swimmer but without viscosity, all right? And so this is a perfect fluid, as they call it. And so there's no vorticity being created. And so what it's doing is somehow moving itself from A to B without producing this obvious sort of momentum here, all right? Now, the point to make here is that there is momentum in this fluid. It just doesn't look like it's not bound up in vorticity. So one thing about vorticity, it's sort of a memory of the fluid as well. It's sort of indicating all the historical motion that this fish has gone through, and it's sort of a residual sort of that motion. It sort of sits there and doesn't die off very quickly. Whereas this has no memory, right? So what this swimmer does is it swims and generates momentum just to move itself forward, But if it stops moving, it instantaneously stops. It won't keep gliding. There's no gliding going on in this thing right here. Whereas this one will glide. And just like, you know, when we swim in the swimming pool, right? If we give ourselves one stroke, we can propel ourselves for a little while and glide, right? That's something that fish rely on all the time, right? This swimmer cannot glide because its momentum in the fluid turns off immediately when it stops moving its own hinges, okay? So that's kind of an effect that's hard to process because we don't have an experience with inviscid fluids. We have no intuition for it. But what this is sort of showing is that it swims faster because there's no drag on this, right? There's no drag on here like there is there. Okay, so all right, so the last problem I'm going to talk about is that same swimmer, that same three-link swimmer, but I'm motivated basically by that, remember that video I showed you at the very beginning from Jimmy Lau's fish behind an obstacle. And there was a follow-on study where they basically put a dead fish behind the obstacle. They just tethered it, right? They just tied it to a string to the obstacle, and they wanted to understand basically what happens to a dead fish. Because their hypothesis was that this is a flexible fish, even though it's dead, right? It's still flexible. It wasn't frozen, right? And so if you put this in the wake of an obstacle, then its natural flexibility should be excited by the wake, right? So it should start giving itself some undulatory locomotion, even without having active muscles to create that, right? So can you extract energy from a fluid motion in order to propel yourself forward in a passive way? Okay, so their study showed that you could, all right, that you could, it would actually move. It was kind of a remarkable thing to see that. And so they, like I said, they attributed it to the fact that the flexible dead fish was extracting energy from the surrounding fluid, the wake of this obstacle, in other words, and was able to move itself closer to, you know, in that direction. Okay, so I'm going to do the same sort of experiment, except I'm going to do it on computationally with my three-link swimmer here. So it's not exactly the same, but it's the same idea. And I'm not going to have a tether. So I have this sort of line here. This line is basically prevents this fish. I'm going to call it a fish. Okay, just bear with me. My fish is not going to be allowed to be swept further downstream than this line right here. So it's like this virtual wall, all right? And the reason for that is because as this flow starts out from rest, in other words, when I turn this flow on here, then at first there's not going to be really a wake that it can exploit. And so it would just be swept away, and I don't want that. So I'm not going to allow it to be swept further down. I'm more interested in, can it move up, okay? And so it'll be free to move upstream, if possible, and also be free to move up side to side as well, all right? So each of these hinges here are completely passive. They don't have any springs, no motors on them. They are just going to be free to rotate under the forces acting on it from the fluid, okay? So here's my first try at this, all right? This was, like I said, when it starts out, the wake behind this cylinder hasn't really developed yet. So it takes a little while to develop, all right? So right now you see this wake behind this cylinder starting to break its symmetry, and now you can see the fish is starting to move back and forth, but it's actually not moving in this direction at all because it's actually stuck against that virtual wall that I mentioned, right? So it's like it's pulling against its tether. So it moves back and forth and undulates, but it doesn't propel itself in any way, okay? So that was the first try. And so we said, okay, let's make it smaller. And so we did the same thing now with a shorter wing. Okay, and okay, so not a short wing, shorter fish. Okay, and so now everything looks about the same at the beginning. It's still stuck against that virtual wall, and then a little bit later, right around now, it starts moving upstream. Okay, so like that. Okay, and it doesn't keep moving; it actually stops. It reaches sort of an equilibrium there. So it moves most definitely upstream without any of its own energetic input. So it's extracting energy from the flow. And so that was interesting. So it matters how long it is, all right? So that longest case, this is L over D. D is the diameter of the cylinder, and L is the length of that fish. So when it's too long, then basically there's too much drag on it, okay? So there's too much drag, so it just gets held at that virtual limit, that virtual wall. When I make it a little shorter, then it starts moving upstream, but then it actually moves back downstream again. So it starts to move towards the cylinder, and then it moves back again. And then finally, when I make it really short, it actually moves even closer. So I was interested in this because it's obviously indicating energy is being sort of harvested or extracted from the flow. And so I asked a question that, I don't know, it seemed like an obvious one to ask, which is the body flexibility important for this? So it was taken for granted, I think, by that study at Harvard that the flexibility was essential for this. So they had just done the study with this dead trout, okay, and they got their conclusion. I'm going to just do the obvious thing with my model. I'm going to make those hinges locked, all right? So now it's still a 3-link swimmer, but the links are all frozen in place. So it's not going to be allowed to flex, all right? And so I'll put that in a swimmer. So what, anyone venture a guess? Is it going to swim or not? No, exactly. I'm glad. I like the bold answer. This is exactly what I wanted. Okay, because you set it up perfectly. Because it does. So it goes upstream. So it doesn't matter that it's flexible at all, at least for this system. All right. So what's happening, right? So it moves totally fine upstream without being. It's not extracting energy in the way that we may have thought from the wake. And so why? And so let me just show you the comparison. This is the one this is the trajectory of this fish, so to speak, with free hinges, all right? And this is the one I just showed you with locked hinges. This is my frozen fish, okay? And it's a little more effective even. It's almost the same trajectory. And it swims a little further upstream than the other one. So and so the question is why? And to understand why, it helps to understand what's going on in the wake of an obstacle. And this is true about any obstacle, not just a cylinder. When in the wake of an obstacle, there's suction, basically. So I got this region back here that's a region of low pressure. This is one of the reasons why there's drag on an obstacle. It's partly because there's low pressure back here, all right? So this region is pretty limited, though. It's only a couple diameters long behind an obstacle. So it doesn't. That's what actually the Harvard team basically was trying to prevent that from being an issue. So they put their fish way back here, like 5 diameters downstream. And because they didn't want this to be the reason for it moving forward. Except that when you place an obstacle in the wake, when you place something in the wake of an obstacle, when you place like a fish in the wake of an obstacle, it changes that suction zone. It makes it longer. So when you put a fish back there, it makes it even longer. It makes it twice or even 3 times as long. So just by putting this fish back there, this is actually well known because people have been using techniques like this to change the drag characteristics on obstacles all the time. They actually like place flags and things like that behind things. And so they've known this. This is actually known from some work of my friend Don Rockwell at Lehigh University. So he had known this for decades already. And so I just mined his results and basically confirmed it here for ourselves, that by placing the fish back there, it actually it sucks even more, right? So to speak. Okay, so to speak. All right. This fish is being sucked, whether it's flexible or whether it's rigid. It doesn't matter. Okay. All right. So I think that I'm a little bit. I think I'm about right on time here. The conclusions I want to make here are that are fairly simple. I don't have very specific conclusions except to say that these simple abstracted models of locomotion, biolocomotion in fluids can provide us with some insight. Okay, let's just leave it like that. But I also want to point out that I've been using these sort of problems as teaching tools as well. And the reason why is because engineers learn fluid dynamics with a couple of key target problems in mind. They're learning about it because they're going to design aircraft, wings and things like that. So they learn basic aerodynamics, or they need to know how fluids move through pipes, for example, right? The sort of things we do with fluids as engineers. Okay, and it doesn't vary that much from there. And the curriculum in fluid mechanics hasn't changed much in about a century. Okay, really, it's kind of embarrassing actually. You can ask any person who studied engineering, and the syllabus they studied, whenever they studied it, was the same as what I'm teaching now. All right. Now that makes me look bad, but it also means that we need to think about how we, what are our target problems, and they're evolving. Okay. All right. So I use biolocomotion to help us explain fundamental concepts that we don't usually see in a conventional fluid dynamics class. So aerodynamics of stall, right? So we saw stall as being actually a benefit to insects. And just understanding the view of stall from that point of view is important. And so it can be used, for example, for maneuvering small vehicles around better. So a lot of small vehicles can be made more agile if we can exploit stall as opposed to trying to avoid it. So I use that. Large-scale fluid structure interactions. So of course, all aircraft, like I mentioned at the very beginning, they all are a bit flexible. So we have to deal with what's called aeroelasticity, aeroelastic, right? Those effects are important for designing aircraft. But they don't occur at the large scales. I mean, insect wings or the fish body, they all are flexing much more substantially in under the load of the fluid than we would get in most human-made vehicles. So these sort of fluid structure interactions are much more substantial in biolocomotion. And so you have to sort of embrace that strong interaction from the very beginning. You can't ignore it, all right? The other thing is just kinematics, okay? Just talking about motion in general, like how do I describe the motion of an insect wing mathematically is really challenging. In fact, there really aren't any, the closest we can come up with in a human-made vehicle is a helicopter, right? Helicopters have about 4 different reference frames because you have to look at it from the ground reference frame, the vehicle reference frame, and then the rotor blade reference frame, which keeps changing, right? So it's all these, but insects have even more, right? Because they can change their stroke plane dynamically and so on. So just describing the motion of insect wings is really challenging. So it motivates kinematics in a very interesting way. And force and energy, right? So force is, what is the fluid exerting on the wing or the fin and so on, and energy, okay? And the roles of vorticity, which I've tried to make a case for today. There's other things we're doing right now. A lot of the stuff I showed you actually is a little bit from a few years ago, but the things I'm doing now, I'm interested in actually in sensing as a topic, hydrodynamic sensing and aerodynamic sensing. So for example, fish have lateral line organs. To what extent can they use that to map out the fluid motion around them? I'm interested in that from a vehicle standpoint. If I build a wing and I want to know, am I in stall or not, let's do better than what, say, Boeing does and actually build a wing that actually knows more about its flow situation than we otherwise would, and use that for making decisions, okay? So I'm interested in this relationship between sensors and the fluid flow, all right? So that's a big part of what we do right now. I'm also still interested in energy harvesting and flexible structures and fluid structure interactions in general. And then I just want to call attention to the stuff that Malcolm and I have been doing in the last couple of years. One of the things that I find really interesting is seeing these sort of possibilities for how fish can exploit things, features of their body, their physiology, maybe in ways that we didn't imagine. So I just want to very briefly switch presentations because this is in PowerPoint instead of Keynote. This was the work of our master's student, David Lung, that he finished a couple of years ago. Oops, that didn't show up. Let's see. I don't know how to swap displays. Okay. Okay. PowerPoint is set up in a mode where it doesn't mirror the desktops properly. So how am I going to do this? Okay. Bear with me while I try to figure that out. I'm sure there's a button here, swap displays. How about that? There we go. Okay, well, that's not quite what I wanted, but good enough for now. Okay. This is a question of, in labriform swimming, which are done with the pectoral fins, then they have the gill opening right in front of there, right? And so the respiratory flow coming out of the gill is right there in front of this pectoral fin. And so the question is there a substantial hydrodynamic interaction that might be important for locomotion? So here's our model. This is a 2-dimensional view of things. Again, 2D. I was thinking of the joke that no one could ever call me a 1-dimensional researcher, but I'm certainly not 3D either, so somewhere in the middle. So I have an opercular opening model here, which is, again, it's just in the plane. So there's a jet coming out of here. You can barely see this, but this is a flexible wall here. And this is the model of the pectoral fin, which is, just for our sake, fairly rigid. Okay, it's not changing its shape from being like that. And so we're just interested in, again, some abstraction here, imagining the jet that comes out of here that interacts with that fin as the fin is going through its oscillatory motion. So let's show the movie here. This is all that really matters. So you can see basically, this is the vorticity of this problem, just like I've shown vorticity in other movies today. And then you can see jets that come out of here. So basically these jets come, and the jet is easier to see with the velocity magnitude here. So the jet comes and interacts with the fin, and the timing of those interactions or the timing of those features that are important. So what we found basically is it is important, but it's pretty subtle. And so probably our conclusion at this point, I think, is that it's not probably going to make them more effective at swimming forward, but it can be varied on either side of the body to make maneuvering a little bit easier. All right. So I'm not quite ready for showing all those results, but I think we're work in progress. Okay. Okay. So that's all I have. Okay.
Yep. Right away. Isn't it the case that when you're showing the vortex streets, that they actually are vortex rings?
Yes, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. Right.
So that explains why one is clockwise and the other one is
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
so you need to keep that in mind. There is a third dimension to this, even though he doesn't like it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So even in 2D, without the full ring, it still shows up as counter-rotating vortices. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yes.
So, should aircraft have flexible wings?
Well, that's an excellent question. That's right. Yeah. So when I teach this class on fluid dynamics of biological systems, where I'm emphasizing the fluid dynamics part and using biology as sort of a target to analyze, I ask the students very early on in the term, why don't we build aircraft that flap their wings? And the answer is that it scales very poorly up to that size. All right, and it's because if you scale the amount of mass that I need, for example, and I look at also the energy requirements of flapping and so on, then you can make reasonable arguments that are pretty convincing about why creatures have sort of sized out, I think, as well, but why vehicles that we need to fly in, the ones that carry people around, will never be able to flap because energetically it's too much of a cost. And so flexibility is a different question.
So the argument that when you said flexibility, it actually reduces the energetic cost. Itself scales in size.
Yeah, well, so I think that flexibility reduces the energetic cost of flapping, but not for fixed wings, right? So if I keep those questions separate, then the fixed wing with flexibility, that is a little more subtle. So the flexibility of a wing has to avoid what's called flutter. Flutter is basically when it starts flapping without you wanting it to, basically. And that's something we avoid. So we tailor the flexibility of an aircraft wing to avoid flutter. But if I am trying to flap my wings, then it's a benefit. That's what I would say. But we just can't flap our wings on a 747 or that size. There was about 10 years ago, there was a sequence of YouTube videos. Again, YouTube has everything. Of a person who was going through the process of building wings for human-powered flight. And so they were going to flap them. They had little joysticks where they can move these. They had like a 12-foot wingspan or something like that. And so the very last video of him was actually him running through the park in Amsterdam and taking off. It's like, wait, we've generated, that would be the first known example of an aircraft, of a human flapping their wings to fly. And it was fake. But all the news services started calling aerodynamics people and saying, is this real? Is this real? And we all said, no. But it was a no with a question mark because we weren't entirely sure, but it was fake. He admitted it. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome.